Russia is now facing one of the most equipped armies in Europe. Yes, the Ukrainian army has become a complete deterrent for Russia, thanks to striking military and financial support of the US and Western Europe. Undoubtedly, the United States under Joe Biden was one of the countries that had the most important share in the Ukrainian forces' attainment of this power. Thanks to US military support, Ukrainian forces now consist of at least a dozen brigades. According to some intelligence sources, the armed forces of Ukraine has 18 brigades. 9 of the Ukrainian army's brigades were armed by Western allies, according to U.S. intelligence documents leaked earlier this month. In addition, in the last period, a total of more than 230 tanks, more than 1,000 other armored vehicles and 150 field artillery units were supplied to the Ukrainian army. The most effective step in tank aid was taken in Germany. Representatives from nearly 50 countries discussed systems and supply issues for Kiev at the Ramstein talks held in Germany hosted by the United States on management. This meeting had a great impact on the world agenda. After the meeting, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced that M1 Abrams tanks were sent to the Ukrainian army recently after Austin's statements. Abrams tanks were spotted at the training ground in Nowa in southeastern Poland. Currently, it is estimated that some of these tanks are used on the front lines in Ukraine. This striking U.S. military support is expected to play a key role in helping the Ukrainian army win this war. Because the M1 Abrams is a very powerful third-generation main battle tank in the inventory of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. The M1 Abrams is a tank developed for the U.S. Modern Armored Warfare Program. Equipped with a 1,500 HP gas turbine engine, sophisticated composite armor, and an isolated ammunition storage cabinet in a separate explosion cell for personal safety. That's why these war beasts of the U.S. and ready to raise Russia's military losses in trench and tank wars in Ukraine far above record levels. The U.S. also announced that it will train the Ukrainian army for M1 Abrams tanks. The United States will begin training Ukrainian forces in how to operate and maintain Abrams tanks in the coming weeks and will continue to step up efforts to get them to the battlefield as soon as possible. The critical announcement was made by the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. The decision was announced as defense leaders from Europe and around the world met at Ramstein Air Base in an effort to coordinate the delivery of weapons and other equipment to Ukraine. According to U.S. officials, 31 tanks will arrive at the Grafen War Training Ground in Germany at the end of May, and the troops will begin training in a few weeks. Officials stated that the troop training will take about 10 weeks. Also, according to U.S. officials, about 250 Ukrainian soldiers will be trained. Some of the Ukrainian soldiers who will participate in the training will learn to use tanks, while others will learn to repair and maintain them. Additional training on how to fight and maneuver tanks can also be given after the first 10 weeks. Training tanks will not be those supplied to Ukraine for use in the war against Russia. Instead, 31 M1A1 battle tanks are being upgraded in the United States, and these will go to the front lines when they are ready. The goal of the U.S. is to train Ukrainian troops until the refurbished Abrams tanks are ready so they can jump into battle immediately. So far, the U.S. has trained 8,800 Ukrainian soldiers who have returned to the battlefield, and roughly 2,500 more are currently training. Their training included everything from basic weapons training to how to conduct combat operations and maintenance and repair of equipment. From now on, the U.S. wants the Ukrainian armed forces to be one of the most equipped armies in Europe by training much more Ukrainian soldiers on battle tanks. Western allies are increasing supplies of military equipment to Russia, which is preparing to face a possible renewed offensive by Russia this spring. Germany hesitated for months on whether to send its tanks to Ukraine and eventually succumbed to international pressure. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has previously announced that Ukrainian tank crews have started training on Leopard 1 tanks, and 80 of these vehicles will be gradually transferred to Ukraine in 2023. Meanwhile, Germany signed a memorandum of understanding with Poland and Ukraine to establish a maintenance center for Kiev's Leopard 2 tank fleet in Poland, close to the Ukrainian border. The German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, told reporters that his military center will cost 150 to 200 million euros per year. Meanwhile, hundreds of Western infantry fighting vehicles have arrived in Ukraine so far this month, including British Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 main battle tanks, as well as US-made Bradleys and German-made Martyrs. Photos and striking data showing the arrival of these tanks in Ukraine had a wide impact in the world press. According to the footage, NATO tanks were on their way to Ukraine before major counterattacks against Russian forces. In addition, the Canadian Armed Forces posted photos on social media of German-made Leopard 2 tanks landing in southwest Poland on the last leg of their journey to Ukraine as part of Canada's commitment to ship 8 of its main battle tanks to Ukraine. These tanks were transported under the Royal Canadian Air Force CC-107 Globemaster III plan. Canadian Leopard 2s arrived in southwestern Poland on April the 11th. But photos of the passage of tanks have been published in recent weeks. Alongside Canada, Spain was one of the countries that sent Leopard main battle tanks to the Ukrainian army. 6 Leopard tanks left Spain and were on their way to Ukraine to increase their military capacity. These tanks were loaded on the cargo ship and transported to Poland by sea. The Spanish Leopard tank shipped from Santander belonged to an older model Type 2A4. These tanks have been out of service for a long time and have been stored in a warehouse near Zaragoza since 2012. Spanish Leopard tanks were refurbished and tested for battlefield use before being sent to Ukraine. In addition to sending Leopard battle tanks to the Ukrainian army, Spain was also appreciated by training them. The Spanish Ministry of Defense reported that the training of Ukrainian soldiers in the country for the Leopard 2A4 type tanks was carried out successfully. The Spanish Ministry of Defense stated that the training of 10 tank crews was carried out in special training areas provided by the Toledo Training Coordination Center in Zaragoza. The team of 10 Ukrainian tank men became the first military group to complete special training courses in Spain. On the other hand, military analysts and Ukrainian politicians consider Western tanks and combat vehicles to be game changers for success against Russian forces. After the Russian spring offensive failed to make any serious gains in the eastern regions, Ukraine is now preparing for major counterattacks. With the arrival of Western battle tanks in the next few weeks, Western military equipment is believed to be essential for Ukraine's attempts to push back Russian forces in the occupied territories towards its southern and eastern borders. The Ukrainians are expected to make major attempts to divide the Russian land corridor, according to Alexei Danilov, chief of Ukraine's security services. Only a small fraction of Ukrainian officials know the details of the imminent counterattack against Russia. We have reached the number of people Alexei Danilov meant for you. Only 5 Ukrainian officials are aware of the exact plans, while information on how the counterattacks might take place is kept secret. Yes, it is not known whether this secret plan will lead Ukraine to a decisive victory, but it seems certain that these curious counterattack plans of the Ukrainian forces will make a lot of noise. Equipped with less modern T-72 and 90 tanks, Russian troops may struggle to defend against advancing Ukrainian forces, but the muddy ground and relative lack of surprise has some officials worried. But if the Ukrainian army can advance towards the occupied city of Melitopol as part of its grand offensive plans, it may cut off the Russian supply lines from the Crimean Peninsula to the Donbass, where most of the fighting is taking place. The Russians, on the other hand, can develop defensive measures against these plans of the Ukrainians. In fact, defensive intelligence reported that Russia has finished building a 3-layered defense along the 75-mile front line in Zaporizhia province. It is thought that the preparations are underway in Melitopol for a structure similar to this defense line, because recently released satellite images showed dragon-teeth anti-tank lines running southeast along the 7 highway in front of Melitopol. But the Ukrainians continue to amass much more of their soldiers on the front lines with the battle tanks they procured from the West and the USA. In addition, military units that are more equipped for Western tanks are accelerating the counterattack plans of the Ukrainian army. In summary, the Ukrainian army is waiting in a state that has made all its preparations, and Kiev is now managing its war strategy with finishing moves. The Russia-Ukraine war is approaching its first year. Developments in the war show that Russia is running out of power. Russia is losing ground against the Ukrainian army, which is getting stronger day by day with the support of Western and European countries. Sanctions imposed from all over the world, problems in the stock and supply of ammunition, and the fact that almost all of the Russian people are against the occupation put the Russian army in a difficult situation. One of the biggest problems facing the Russian army is the surrender of Russian soldiers to the Ukrainian armed forces. Thousands of Russian soldiers have surrendered to the Ukrainian army, and this number is increasing day by day. Russian soldiers have been sharing videos from the conflict zones since the beginning of the war. In these videos, the soldiers openly express that they are being forced to fight and that they are being tortured. Russian soldiers either flee from the front or surrender to the Ukrainian army at the first opportunity they find. In September, Ukraine launched a project called I Want to Live to strengthen the increasing number of surrenders and to help Russian soldiers in this regard. Under this project, thousands of Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian troops. The I Want to Live project consists of a phone, a website, and an application that allows Russian soldiers to surrender to Ukrainian forces. Soldiers contact the Ukrainian forces using the method that suits them. The soldiers whose information is received as a result of communication must fulfill the necessary conditions for surrender. The soldier who wants to surrender must cross into Ukrainian territory. I Want to Leave teams then reach the location of this Russian soldier on Ukrainian territory. Authorities conduct reconnaissance with mini drones in the area where the soldier is located and ask the soldier to follow the drone unarmed and with his hands raised. The soldier who fulfills the conditions is welcomed by the I Want to Leave teams in the area where he arrives. The surrendered soldiers are then transferred to safe areas. We tell him what we encode is spokesperson for the I Want to Live project, and the Department of Prisoners of War recently told a local media outlet that this project will save the lives of soldiers who do not support Putin's occupation plan, and that there will be fewer occupying soldiers on the front line. Millions of Russians have called the I Want to Live hotline, which was launched in September. Andriy Yusov, spokesman for the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, said that this number is increasing day by day. USO said that it is not only frontline soldiers who are calling the I Want to Live project. Relatives of anti-occupation Russian soldiers can also call the hotline to get information, he said. The Russian people who have been disturbed by the loss of their spouses, friends and relatives for the sake of Putin's personal wishes since the beginning of the war can save their relatives from the occupied territories with the Iron Tulip project. Although Vitaly Matvienko, the spokesperson of the I Want to Live project and the Department of Prisoners of War, did not make a statement about the number of Russian soldiers who surrendered. It has claimed that 6,543 Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian troops from September 2022 to January 2023. So why are Russian soldiers surrendering to Ukraine? There are many reasons for this. Let's answer this question together. The vast majority of Russian soldiers have been conscripted into the army as part of forced mobilization. Almost all of these soldiers are against the occupation and do not want to fight. Although Putin tries to keep those who do not want to fight at the front, these people leave the front at the first opportunity. One of the reasons for the surrender of Russian soldiers is the chaos within the Russian army. The Russian army includes many different units. These units cannot get along with each other. The incompatibility between soldiers belonging to the Wagner Group, a private military company that is actively working in the occupied territories, pro-Russian Chechens loyal to Kadyrov and soldiers belonging to the Russian army can be given as an example of this situation. The soldiers of the Wagner Group do not listen to the commanders of the Russian army. The Wagner Group, which has to depend on the Russian army in every operation it carries out, acts independently of the army. This situation causes conflict within the army. In addition, Chechen soldiers are humiliated by the Russian army and the soldiers of the Wagner Group because of their race. This causes turmoil within the army. The biggest reason for the surrender of the Russian soldiers is the successful attacks of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army continues to destroy the bases, ammunition depots, and gathering areas of the Russian invaders. The Russian army is suffering heavy losses in the face of American-made HIMARS missile systems, Turkish-made Bayraktar B-2 unmanned aerial vehicles, and other advanced equipment. In just the first week of the new year, the Russian army lost one of its most important ammunition depots, Kadyrov's largest headquarters, and thousands of soldiers. For these reasons and many more, Russian soldiers continue to surrender to Ukraine. It is not known what Putin will do in the face of this setback. Putin, the Russian leader, has several plans in mind, aiming to both buy time and get stronger. But none of these plans are successful. Putin's recent calls for negotiations are interpreted as buying time because Putin needs time to solve the problem of depleted ammunition and dwindling troops. Another plan Putin has in mind is to involve Belarus in the invasion of Ukraine. Russian leader Vladimir Putin visited his Belarusian counterpart, Alexander Lukashenko, in the last month of 2022. After this visit, many commentators said that Putin had asked Belarus for help. The Belarusian leader's statements confirmed these comments because about a week after his meeting with Putin, Lukashenko said, "If you want peace, prepare for war. I did not invent it, and neither did you." After this statement, there was activity on the Belarus-Ukraine border. The Russian army announced that it was training with Belarusian soldiers on the Belarus-Ukraine border. However, there has not yet been a conflict between Belarus and Ukraine. Putin did not succeed in these plans either. Russian leader Vladimir Putin lost our 120,000 soldiers and thousands of tons of ammunition in the war. Faced with a shortage of both military personnel and ammunition, Putin is having difficulty solving this problem. Not wanting to fight, Russian soldiers leave the front. Russian people continue to take to the streets of Russia with anti-occupation protests against these negative developments in Russia. Ukraine is showing great success. The ground and air operations of the Ukrainian army in the occupied territories do not give the Russian occupiers a chance to move. The people of Ukraine, as well as the army, are showing great resistance against the occupation. Ukrainian President Zelensky is united with the people and the army. The Ukrainian army is making history against the Russian invaders. It is not known what Putin, who is getting isolated day by day, will do against the strengthening Ukraine. What do you think about the I Want to Live project? Why do you think Russian soldiers are leaving the front lines? How do you evaluate the success of the Ukrainian army? Will Putin be able to continue the war with its depleted power? Here are the Russians managed to breach one of the key points on the Ukrainian defense line and cause a local collapse on the front. This gave the Russians a chance to double the number of assaults on the last remaining settlements north of Bakhmut. And unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the Russians managed to push them out on the last day of suitable weather. Last time I told you that the Russians concentrated their assault units to the north of Bakhmut in order to take control over the last settlements on the line before the weather conditions deteriorated. In particular, Barvika, Yardny, and train station Stupik. The situation in Burawika was very dire, and the Russians managed to push the Ukrainians out of this village after one day of additional clashes. The situation around Yadin was more stable, and the Ukrainians here even conducted a successful counterattack. But unfortunately, with the fall of Marievka, the defense line quickly fell apart. The Russians managed to overwhelm the Ukrainians with fire by opening additional lines of attack and eventually capturing Yadin. After that, they basically put the Ukrainians near the train station into a salient. so the Ukrainians were forced to step back from this position as well in order to slow down the Russians. The Ukrainians have blown up a small dam on the outskirts of Bakhmut. The release of the water flooded the streets between Ukrainian and Russian-controlled territories and also cut off some Russian positions from the mainland, which in the short term diminished the room for maneuver. The Ukrainians here got very unlucky because the Russians managed to achieve their tactical goals during the last day of the suitable for massive assaults weather. As you can see from the video, the Ukrainians blew up the dam when it already started raining. The video was filmed in the morning when it was still cold, so there was a mixture of snow and rain. But recent videos from Bakhmut clearly show that the snow has almost entirely melted because around a week ago everything was still white. The latest developments mean that there are no Ukrainian fortifications between Russian positions and the last highway leading out of Bakhmut. There are several small roads between this highway and Ivanovskaya, but they are going through the fields, and with the current weather, the chance of getting stuck is very high. One of the things that the Ukrainians can do is to capitalize on their recent gains in the forest near Ivanovskaya and continue pushing the Russians further south. This should give them more room for withdrawal by using the highway to get to Ivanovskaya, and once they reach Ivanovsky, they would still need to go through the fields because the bridge is destroyed. But these fields should be easier to cross because they are located on the higher ground and therefore should be drier. When it comes to Bakhmut itself, it looks like the Ukrainians are finishing their withdrawal from the eastern bank. Yesterday, the group was finally split into two small groups. As predicted, one group is slowly withdrawing via the northern bridge and another one via the dam. Some sources even suggest that the Russians already control the whole residential area with small houses and one of the two high-rise building areas. When it comes to the number of troops left, Russian sources suggest that they are expecting to capture up to 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers. However, this number is based on the assumption that all the brigades that are involved in the defense of Bakhmut are in full force and are all inside Bakhmut, which is not true at all. Each brigade is represented only by a few elements, while most troops are kept out of Bakhmut for rotation purposes. According to the military-affiliated spokesman, there are no more than 5,000 troops in Bakhmut. And given that this report is outdated at the moment, the Ukrainians likely have even fewer troops. This is not unlikely because during the battle for Severodonetsk, there were only 2,500 soldiers holding the city, and at the final stages it took the Ukrainians only 600 troops to defend most of the industrial zone, and Severodonetsk is almost exactly the size of Bakhmut, which makes it for a fair comparison. The estimated number of troops suggests that the city is not overcrowded and withdrawal remains an option. But the deteriorating weather conditions make the whole situation tricky because on the one hand, it is unlikely that the Russians will be able to establish full control over the roads, but on the other hand, it makes it very hard to use the remaining roads in the fields. But very soon we will see how the Ukrainians decide to act under the current circumstances.